Good afternoon. Welcome everyone to Cross River Partnership's third lunchtime launch session. I hope you're all keeping very well. Also hope you have some delicious lunch in front of you to eat while we're speaking together. This session will be all about the future of town centres and how to help them succeed as part of a fair, safe, clean and green recovery from COVID. My name is Susanna Wilkes, Director here at Cross River Partnership, and over the next 45 minutes, we'll be sharing with you the results of our most recent research on town centres and high streets, including the wealth of evidence sitting behind changes already happening in our town centres, case studies showing support that can be galvanised across 10 different types of town centre, many of which are outside London's central activity zone. Practical recommendations for action will bring together the interlinked public realm, transport, economic activity and community aspects of supporting successful town centre futures. So before we make a start, a few bits of housekeeping I would like to mention. This lunchtime launch session is being recorded and will be available to view online. I know you'll be able to see that there's just one person watching this event. Please don't worry, you're definitely not alone, and I can assure you there's a lot more than one person. If you have any difficulty seeing or hearing during this lunchtime launch, please make sure you've joined us via the Google Chrome browser. We find this one definitely works the best. You should have PowerPoint slide visuals and speaking voices throughout this session, both at the same time. If you do have any problems at all, please try logging out and rejoining the session. Great, so during today's lunchtime launch session, we're going to be joined by a number of experts from across the industry. These include Debbie Jackson of Westminster City Council, Richard Brown of Centre for London, and Rachel Aldridge of CRP. We'll also be joined by CRP's Ross Phillips, who'll be moderating the chat facility on the right of your screens. And last but no means least, we have CRP's Josh West leading all of our tech for the session. Thank goodness for Josh. So during this session, we're going to cover all of these topics on your screens, and we'll launch officially the CRP Commissioned Recommendations Report on Town Centre Futures. There'll be a chance for you to have your pre-submitted questions answered at the end of all the presentations. We will try our very best to answer all your questions, but if we run out of time, we'll respond to key themes after this live session. So before we make a start, I'd like to pose a question to you, the audience. What do you think will keep communities using various types of town centre now that we've all got used to being home birds and living life differently during COVID? Pop your thoughts in the chat box to the right of the screens, remembering to add your name and organisation too. Without further ado, I'd just like to tell you a tiny bit more background before we get on to launching the report. Just in case any of you out there are new to Cross River Partnership, CRP was formed 27 years ago to build bridges across the River Thames, including the Golden Jubilee footbridges, recently showcased by the Sunday Times as great examples of women-friendly urban design. CRP's vision is to empower people to deliver innovative projects that support places to respond well to the challenges being thrust upon us. These are the values that CRP holds dear to everything it does. All of the interventions that you hear about this afternoon are about enabling positive change, useful collaborations to take place, and lessons on a sustainable recovery from COVID to be shared between different organisations, both within and outside London. So by now, CRP is delivering London's future together with partners including local authorities, business improvement districts, and other strategic and community agencies. The Town Centre Futures report that we're launching today complements the geographical area for the GLA's Economic Futures work, which focuses very much on the central activity zone within London. Within the CAS, there are further sub-geographies, including the West End, that is largely overseen by Westminster City Council. In order to give us a few more opening remarks and set the scene before Centre for London officially launches our Town Centre Futures report, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Debbie Jackson, Executive Director for Growth Planning and Housing at Westminster City Council.
Okay, thanks, Susanna. I'm going to keep talking until someone tells me they can't hear me. So let's hope this is all working. Thank you, and thank you to CRP for inviting me to be here today, and thank you to everybody for joining as well. It's nice to see quite a few familiar names there. Briefly, I'm just going to do a bit of scene setting really, and then hand over to the main act, which Richard's going to tell us about the work that they've been doing. But to introduce myself, as Susanna said, I am the Executive Director for Growth Planning and Housing at the GLA. And as part of that role, I'm responsible for all things place, economy, homes, regeneration. So really important for this discussion today, and I'm really looking forward to hearing, to listening to everybody's contributions. I'm also going to draw a little bit on my previous role. I joined Westminster Council in July, but before that I was at the GLA. And at the GLA, I led the Regeneration Economic Development team, and high streets was a bit of a specialist subject for us. We did a lot of work around funding programmes, but also a lot of thinking as well. So I'm perhaps going to draw a little bit on my previous and my current role today. I always look forward to a discussion on high streets. Everybody's interested in high streets. Everybody's got a local one and has a view. And so everyone's got a stake in the conversation. So it's always a very lively and sort of active debate. And just thinking about my role at Westminster now and sort of my job, if you like, in relation to the high streets and town centres that Westminster hosts. One of the reasons why I'm particularly looking forward to this discussion today is that it's not focusing so much on the West End. It's focusing on some of those local town centres, because of course Westminster is very importantly hosts the West End, and the West End hosts a number of distinctive neighbourhoods, but of course it does also host a number of local town centres, and indeed in an ecosystem kind of way, the West End has got relationships to all of London in terms of the jobs it supports and the supply chains it supports. But I'm really interested having that discussion about some of those more local town centres today, and hearing some of the contributions. Just can't talk about this without talking about the current challenge we've got in front of us. I mean, you know, our shops are shut at the moment. We can't ignore that and what that's going to mean for the city. Of course, we have some pre-existing trends in terms of restructuring of retail, but there's also a rewiring that we all sense in terms of how behaviours could change and what that means for town centres. And in my head, I think of it in terms of survive, revive and thrive, where survive is what we've done through the pandemic in terms of local economies and local businesses. But as measures get released, we move into revive, and how do we sort of reanimate our town centres? But then thrive, when we've no longer got measures, when we can hug again. What does our sort of post-pandemic state look like? It seems clear that there's scarring, and some of that scarring is quite deep in terms of our local economies. I think back to the work that I did in the recession following in sort of 2010, 2011. And one of the things that I recall from that is it's a moment of real innovation and creativity. Town centres have proven themselves across the ages to be incredibly resilient. And I think the question in front of all of us is how we support the adaptation of town centres to the next chapter. I do remain confident in terms of our economy, but I know we can't take that for granted. And town centres will need to be places people want to visit for a variety of reasons that meet their needs. I think there's an interesting point here about the role of local authorities in relation to their economies and the relationship that those local town centres have to the communities and to the well-being of the communities. And again, when I was at the GLA, we did some research into this to look not just at the economic role of town centres, but also their role as social and civic assets, and some of the informal networks and the informal support networks that are particularly important to some of our more deprived communities. And as sort of policy makers, we should really bear that in mind when we're thinking about the process of change of our communities. I'm sure we'll talk about it a bit today. You know, some of the core values I have around working around town centres are around partnership, around understanding the unique characteristics of town centres, around valuing the diverse economy and the diverse communities that those places serve, but also about understanding the sort of the above and behind. So it's not just that ground floor retail strip, it's about what happens and really understanding the economy of the town centres. Anyway, I'm gonna get off the podium now, and I'm gonna hand over to Richard, who's going to tell us about this really important piece of work that Centre for London have done, looking at those 10 town centres, but also pulling that work together to draw some conclusions and recommendations. So, Richard, the floor is yours.
Debbie, thank you very much, and thank you very much to Cross River Partnership for commissioning this report and inviting me to come along and talk today. It was really exciting to be given the chance to do this piece of work at the end of last year, because we've been keen to spend some time thinking about how what's happened during the pandemic has augmented and in some cases accelerated what was already happening before the pandemic, and what that means for London's future. And this, in a way, is also a building block, as well as a specific report on London's town centres, is also a building block for our longer term work on London's futures as a whole. And for those who haven't done it, it would be great for people to engage with our Your Future London tool, which starts to talk about the longer term issues for London's future. This is a great opportunity, as I said, to take a snapshot of some of the issues affecting London's town centres, particularly those around the fringe of central London, I guess, to look at understanding how those affect different places differently, and to make some recommendations, particularly for the short to medium term, of how we could actually make the most of the opportunities and address some of the challenges that's emerging. I'd just like to thank also my colleagues who did most of the work on the report, Eric and Nico, Claire, Nikita and Mario. It was a real team effort within Centre for London, so thank you to all of them. So the report produces evidence reviews, 10 case studies, 10 archetypal town centres, if you like. I mean, it's impossible to come up with a definitive typology of town centres. I think Debbie will know this number better than I do. I think the GLA has previously done work assessing that there are something like 650 distinct high streets and town centres across London, and each of those is probably distinct in some particular way. We came up with 10 that give an idea of the range of different town centres in the CRP area. And we set out some recommendations, as I said, for short to medium term action. London's town centres are the infrastructure of everyday life in the city. It's something that actually characterises London much, and the way it's grown together compared to some other cities that have been planned from the centre out. They're part of its character. They're part of the joy of London. That any weekend you can visit somewhere completely different. And then, I suppose, the DNA through which London has replicated and grown itself over the generations, over the centuries. And when the pandemic came along, they were already facing some challenges, particularly the restructuring of retail and the shift to online shopping, particularly also some restructuring in hospitality. And we've got another report coming out in a little while about London's pubs and how they've been faring, but some changes in consumption habits in terms of hospitality. But also a rebirth in community engagement and community interest in actually curating and managing the futures of these places. So during the pandemic, obviously, London's town centres received a huge shock. Share of internet sales went up from a fifth to a third of all sales. The greatest loss of activity was in some of the central and major town centres of London. Those are led by visitors, those are led by commuting. And a lot of those during the CRP area have seen big drop-offs in terms of trade, in terms of footfall. On the other hand, some local neighbourhood centres, particularly some smaller district and neighbourhood centres, have fared rather better, have seen people spending a lot more money locally, buying coffees locally, buying lunch locally. And that started to, I suppose, sow the seeds of what could be a town centre revival across the city. But there is still, we shouldn't underestimate the shock that there's been. The Arup GLA work that's intended to complement estimates that employment could take between 3 and 10 years to recover, and estimates that it could be a permanent reduction in activity of 10% in a positive scenario. So a lot of challenges to be overcome. And some of those challenges which Debbie referred to are some rethinks about how we work, how we shop, how we engage with place. We may spend more time working from home. We may spend more time working near home, which offers new opportunities within town centres. We'll probably be looking for, we're all longing to get out and about again and longing to get back into shops and restaurants and pubs and galleries and cafes. Town centres will probably need to reflect that special nature, to become special places where you can enjoy the experience of being in the town centre rather than just using it purely as something functional, somewhere to go and buy particular things. And also I think town centres are a helpful way to rethink other issues, to think how we can reduce traffic and air pollution, to think how we can address some of the health inequalities that have been laid so bare by the crisis, and to think how we can reposition London and reposition the UK in the wake of Brexit and in the wake of a period when our international relations have been pretty choppy, to put it politely. So that was an overview of some of the evidence, what we know has happened. We also did this typology, as I mentioned, of London town centres, and as you can see, almost all within CRP, but we wanted to choose one that reflected some of those outer London conditions a little bit more. And for each of these, and you can see the detail in the report, which should be which should be available. For each of these, we've looked at what the character of the place is, who visits it at the moment, what we know about strategies, and there's a lot more detail for lots of these from the relevant local authority, and what some of the opportunities and threats may be, where there are, for example, challenges from decline in big comparison shopping. A few places on there might spring to mind, where there are challenges from reduction in international travel and in commuting, where there are new opportunities in terms of growth in new growth sectors, everything from tech to life sciences, alternative tourist attractions, more local spending. So where are the challenges, where are the opportunities? And then we use that typology, which is not complete, and I think one could probably find another 10, 20, 30 different generic types of high street and town centre in London. From that, and from our research into what else is going on in this area, we have pulled together some recommendations. So just going to summarise some of these in these 4 areas. And I know that Rachel Aldridge, who's speaking after me, will talk a little bit more about some of the transport issues in particular. But just to give an overview, the trend for outdoor eating and drinking is a possibility to extend and accelerate that. I think one of the few bright spots of last summer was being able to see that life returning to streets in between the lockdowns last summer, and I think that will become more of a permanent feature of London. I think it's an opportunity also to rethink what streets are for. Street closures can be controversial, but I think when there's street closures in order to bring life to a place, they can attract much more support. The Arup reporters use a term which I quite like, and I'm going to steal for this second recommendation, about London's character as a playground. We need to make London's places that are more fun to be, whether that's about performance, whether that's about art displays, whether that's also about amenities. Again, a challenge that people have faced when during the lockdown has been, if they're out and about, finding access to clean toilets, finding access to water. We need to make sure that London's town centres and high streets do offer that quality of environment for everyone. And part of that also, and the subject of a recent report of ours, is the need to have better lighting that can make the public realm feel safe, but also can show off effectively what London has to offer. Second set of recommendations, and I'm going to hasten through these because I know I'm on a timer. Second set of recommendations about adapting our streets to make them more friendly to children, more friendly to everyone. and to think again about freight. So issues such as low traffic neighbourhoods, which have been very sensitive, probably aren't going away. We may need to learn lessons from the experience of last summer, but we need to think how to make streets better for people. We need to think how to be efficient in terms of freight, whether that's through local consolidation centres or other means. We need to think about finding micromobility hubs, building micromobility hubs, where people can interchange between public transport and low carbon local transport alternatives. In terms of economic activity, the trend towards home working or near home working will, I think, continue to a degree. Central London will always have an important draw. It will be an important place, but I think more people spend some time also working at home. So creating the workspaces that work for them. Experimenting with new uses. London will need to innovate and to be creative coming out of this crisis, and actually finding opportunities for meanwhile use in empty commercial space will be valuable. But also using former commercial space for other purposes, for social purposes, such as health facilities, particularly for public health, things that need to be on the high street rather than perhaps in a medicalised setting. And we need to find more ways to actually engage local communities and to make people feel involved in thinking about the future of their places. And we have a report sponsored by Power to Change, among others, coming out about this later this summer. But I think the need for town centre regeneration, town centre futures to be a partnership is very important. And partnerships will also be key to delivering any of these recommendations. We've set out the priorities for the next few years. There are much longer term actions, and I hope in our work on London Futures we'll be reflecting back on how we get through the next few years, but also what's the long-term vision for London that we're aiming for as an innovative and creative city. And we need to make sure that what we do locally is supported by change at national level. It's sometimes hard to get a message that helps London across to government at the moment, but most of these changes that we're suggesting here are things where there's great commonality of interest between London and other big cities. So there's an opportunity here to really push what we need from central government. I'll just close by saying that we're still working through the long-term impacts of the pandemic. We're still working through what London's future will be. But it is, I think, inconceivable that whatever London's future is, London's town centres won't be part of it. And I was just reminded while looking through the report again this morning of a quote we used in the previous report, which I think expresses how London's town centres need to find a sense of purpose amidst their diversity. It's a quote from Dolly Parton, who is not only a funder of vaccines, but a genius on many things. She said, "Find out who you are and do it on purpose." And I think that's the challenge for our town centres. Thank you. And I'm going to hand over now to Rachel, who's going to talk a bit more about the recommendations.
Thank you very much, Richard, and good afternoon, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for this launch. We're really pleased to present this report with Centre for London into the future of London's town centres. So yeah, a huge thank you to our speakers, Debbie and Richard. I'd also really like to thank the partners we consulted as part of this research, including the CRP board and the Central London Sub-Regional Transport Partnership for leading on this study. So I'm just going to go into depth a bit about the last section of the report, the recommendations, of which there are 11, which provide practical steps to achieving transformative interventions in our high streets. So Richard provided a great overview of some of the crucial reasons for the need of this research. We know that the coronavirus crisis has put pressure on our town centres, so along with other factors like an ageing population, the long-term challenges of the climate crisis, we really need action now to respond to the shock of the pandemic for our high streets to be sustained. So they're just the four main reasons laid out in the report on this slide: the central London crisis, impact of COVID, changes to travel and transport, and workforce and employment trends. And we believe that different groups would really benefit from a report which lays out tailored guidance to build back from some of the huge challenges we faced this year, and of course build on lots of other research that's come from the COVID crisis. So these recommendations that we've worked with Centre for London to create lay out the practical steps that BIDs and their partners, businesses, local authorities and the GLA family, so including TfL, can take to improve London's town centres in 2021 and 2022. CRP works with partners collaboratively across boroughs. So we launched this report to address how we can all work together. And it's really important to note that not all ideas will work in all places or all typologies laid out in this report. Some places will already be using these recommendations. In the High Streets for All Challenge event last week, there were some really creative case studies of recent developments in Sutton Works and Harrow Road. So the guidance recommendations in this report builds on a rich set of sources and ideas to support London's recovery. And to have the most impact on town centres and our high streets, we need to be bold and have transformative interventions in our city. So the specific recommendation I'll go into today is number 6 in the report, if you've taken a look at the recommendation section, which is making roads healthier and more child-friendly. So this includes redesign and ways to decarbonise transport journeys. It could be done by introducing designs that facilitate active travel and reduce access for vehicles that contribute to air pollution. We know that Londoners are potentially travelling less and staying closer to home. And cycling has been one of the most resilient modes of travel throughout the pandemic. So the main ambition is to convert petrol vehicle trips to other modes that use less energy, carbon and road space. So in terms of what BIDS and their partners can do, as I said, these are specific recommendations tailored to different groups. So BIDS can consult with businesses to identify how their customers reach them and what their freight and delivery needs are. Identifying options for improving pedestrian and micro-mobility infrastructure. BIDS could also monitor air pollution at key locations, as well as introduce designs that facilitate active travel. As we touched on in our last launch session with Vivacity Labs, monitoring is really crucial to the success of these schemes and finding out what worked in reducing emissions and traffic flow on our streets. And CRP will soon be launching an interactive map to enable both site owners and logistics operators to see what kind of areas across central London have potential space to house last mile delivery hubs that will help to reduce air pollution, congestion and carbon emissions. And I can see Ross has put in the chat about the Clean Air Villages directory. That's a tool we have to see which businesses are delivering across London via ultra-low emission, and it's something BIDS could definitely utilise. In terms of what businesses can do, businesses could support customers to leave their car behind by offering fast delivery services for heavy or bulky items. So these could be transported by a cargo bike or EV, much of the behaviour change that we encourage as part of the Clean Air Villages programme. We also recently launched a Places for All campaign across our social media, which kind of delved into the benefits of neighbourhood schemes such as LTNs, which have been controversial throughout the pandemic. But the image on the left is from this campaign, and the stats from TfL showing that improved accessibility in our streets can increase retail sales by up to 30%. So really showing that better streets are for better business. The ability of high streets to promote active travel lifestyles and improve physical health is really well documented. So local authorities could be bold with how street space is being allocated, including transformative interventions like LTNs and school streets to make the most impact. There's been some recent figures from the GLA showing that school streets are proven to reduce NO2 levels by 23%. So it's about exploring alternative designs that facilitate these journeys. A really great example is the model of Waltham Forest's Mini Holland scheme, now branded livable neighbourhoods. So 40% of Waltham Forest residents don't have access to a vehicle, and it's really vital to make streets safer for both pedestrians and cyclists. They've got 29 kilometres of cycle lanes, 62 new pedestrian crossings over the past 6 years. So they found that footfall has really increased in the local economy. It's quieter, it's a nicer place for people with children, especially in the summer. You can have alfresco dining, it's a lot safer for cyclists. And there should be some links available for the CRP's Healthy Streets Everyday guidance into mobility justice and School Streets guidance we recently published with London Borough of Hackney, which are both really great resources for some more information. Recommendations for the GLA could include contributing funding to public realm improvement schemes, designing TfL routes, redesigning rather, and major intersections within town centres, considering supporting micro-mobility hubs where people can safely leave their bike or scooter, spend more time in town centre before travelling into central London. And we all know that the Street Space scheme by TfL has supported London's boroughs in creating more space for active travel. Investment in infrastructure, such as temporary cycle lanes, has provided easier and more convenient ways of getting around. And the scheme's led to an increase in the number of Londoners living within the 400 metre radius of the London-wide cycle network from 11.5% to 17.9%, which is great. And in terms of empowering communities to request and take local action, there are already some really great opportunities such as Challenge London, so working with communities to identify urgent priorities and invite innovators and entrepreneurs across sectors and disciplines to participate in open challenges. So in terms of how we can show that these recommendations are working once they're implemented, surveys of customer and business satisfaction, overlooking kind of changes over time, as well as changes in visitor numbers, would be a great measure. But I just wanted to note collaboration and emphasise this again, because these recommendations aren't siloed. They involve everyone working together in kind of symbiosis from different districts, so the GLA, businesses, bids, local authorities. It's too early to say what the long-term implications of this crisis will be, but the role that London centres have played in the post-pandemic city will be very different from the roles they played before. So yes, please do see the full report for the list of recommendations and themes, and definitely get in touch with us at CRP, because we're here to help any organisation to put together town centre action plans. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Rachel. And thank you very much to Richard and Debbie as well for extremely insightful presentations. I hope you found them useful and that you've provided yourself with further knowledge on some of the more practical ways we can all support town centres to succeed across London. I do have a number of pre-submitted questions that the audience have sent to us. Perhaps I can turn to you first, Debbie, and ask you about how a local authority ensures a holistic approach to its support for town centres.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to come in on that. And I think, this question is a little bit like the question about, regeneration for me, in that it only succeeds if it is the place where you bring together the multiple policies, programs, funding levers that you've got at your disposal. So I think it's come through in Rachel's presentation, in what Richard said as well, that it really is about collaboration. And I spoke a little bit in my introduction about valuing town centres as not just economic assets, but social and civic assets as well. So I think it's about collaboration around that value of a town centre, and sort of not just seeing them through, a property lens or an economic lens, but actually thinking about the multiple purposes that it serves. And therefore it touches on many parts of a council. So yeah, I think there's two ingredients to that. For me, it's understanding and valuing local town centres, but then also collaborating in a way that tailors to the characteristics of that town centre.
Great, thanks, Debbie. We've also had a question that I think Richard might have a view on in terms of the report's focus on opportunities and actions to revive high streets. And there's a question about whether they're actually worth fighting for, or are we swimming against the tide?
I think certainly they're worth fighting for. There are some big tides breaking over them. But they are, as I said at the outset, they are very much the DNA, the replication mechanism of London. I think losing our town centres would be a huge error. I think what they will have to do is, to a greater or lesser degree, adapt and change and maybe specialise to a certain extent. I think the idea of a generic town centre or high street with the chains that we all know well, actually many of those chains have now disappeared already from our high streets during this crisis, that will struggle. But I think there are huge opportunities to adapt and to create high streets that offer the new mix of workspace, retail space, hospitality space, and community space, that will be really rich and powerful for London. So I think they're definitely worth fighting for. I think they offer that sort of local. In Paris, they talk about the 15-minute city. They provide that local centre of interaction, centre of community life. I think London would be a much poorer city without them. So I think they are something that is valuable to the city, is valued by its visitors, and they're worth fighting to preserve. But there will be challenges for some in coming years. And the GLA creates its hierarchy of town centres in the London plan. I suspect that may see some changes.
Great, thank you, Richard. Rachel, I wonder if I can ask you to comment on how you see environmental initiatives actually supporting financial recovery for town centres?
Yeah, definitely. So firstly, I think there are so many great environmental initiatives out there, whether that be involving transport, waste, energy, that are better for business too, to support recovery. So an example I can think of is local electric vehicle kind of charging infrastructure. We created a case study of this last year on how pod point charging points were set up in Landsec's West 12 shopping centre in Shepherd's Bush, which is one of the typologies focused on in this report. So this kind of addresses air pollution in a highly congested area, but it's helped to electrify more vehicles in and around the town centre. It's encouraged more people to kind of use that parking space and shop in the local town centre, whilst supporting ULEZ coming in. We've also recently been involved with kind of recent sustainability forums for Fitzrovia, Angel Bids, to help bring businesses together and talk about different sustainability related issues. And there's going to be some really great initiatives coming out of businesses talking together about how they can make their businesses greener.
Great, thanks, Rachel. I know in the chat we've got quite a number of points being raised about the September 2020 planning use classes order changes, particularly around the e-uses. And I wonder if Debbie would like to comment on how those may support successful town centre futures.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to come in on that and see the questions. I can see Nikki's asked the question. Hi, Nikki. So the youth classes order came in, and I think there's a lot to like here. And it was a direction that we were heading in already in terms of promoting flexibility and kind of removing the barriers and thresholds for property owners and occupiers to respond to the market, really. So I think that's really positive. I think we need some intelligence and need to monitor, the impact it's had, and we need to give some thought to how we do that, given that it removes the need for permission. So we need to give a think about how we do evaluate that. I think just, one of the things that I think is perhaps less positive is when things flip from active to non-active. So obviously within the new e-use class, you have the ability to shift from whether it's a retail unit or hospitality into an office or use, and I think that could fracture high streets and town centres if we see a real sort of movement in that direction. So I think that's one to watch. But I think overall it's a positive move, and I think what we've got to do is think about how we gather intelligence on how it gets used and the impacts that it has on our town centres and high streets. But generally speaking, I think that flexibility is a good thing.
Absolutely, thanks, Debbie. And I know there's lots more upcoming changes to the planning system in train that we'll all be keeping an eye on and trying to influence positively. Richard, we've also had a question about, does the Town Centres Futures report encourage people to shop local and abandon using the car as a shopping trolley?
That's a great phrase, using the car as a shopping trolley. Really struck home. So thank you for that. I think yes, the report does encourage more active travel patterns, which obviously limit the amount of shopping can be taken away, and more intelligent use of freight. And I think what one might look towards is a a more blended approach to retail, where, and I'm thinking particularly of sort of day-to-day retail, food retail, where some larger bulk goods could be efficiently delivered locally, and then smaller goods, the things you actually want to go and look at and pick up and sniff and check whether they're ripe or not before you take them home, can be carried on a bike or individually. So I think just thinking more intelligently how we shop. I think the days of just filling up your car with a week's shopping are probably dying away, and actually something that does blend different approaches to shopping makes more sense. So I think it's also important. We don't want to see we want to see a reduction in car use across London, but there are parts, particularly of outer London, particularly maybe beyond the scope of this study, where it is still quite tough to actually to find the public transport options and find delivery options that work well for a lot of shopping. So I think in the medium term, and this is where a sort of 20 to 30 year term needs to be thought about, London needs to stop having so many cars parked on its streets, so many cars driving on its streets, but we need to actually work hard to get the alternatives in place as well.
Great, thanks very much, Richard. Rachel, the final question for you is around opportunities for revitalising high streets in promoting the circular economy. Are there any of those?
Definitely. I think, circular economy principles rely on goods being multifunctional or being able to reuse things instead of disposing, and things being single use. So really a more holistic approach. And I think if businesses can get goods sourced more locally, you can kind of utilise refill schemes over single-use materials. There's a Hackney-based business called Top Up Truck, who we've listed on the CRP Clean Air Villages directory, and they deliver groceries and refills via EV, so on an electric milk float. And this is zero carbon, zero waste. I think there's just kind of a win for all sorts of goals, and high street businesses could become really involved with this delivery service and kind of have packaging and waste being taken away in the same journey.
Great. I can see that there's more questions coming in on the chat function that we're not going to have time to answer all of them now, otherwise we'll be here all afternoon, but we will follow up key themes after this afternoon. We will come back to you. So thank you very much for posting all of those comments there in the chat, and do have a good look at the Town Centre Futures report when you have the chance. As far back as ancient Greece, the Agora wasn't just the economic centre of the city, but also the meeting grounds, hangout spot, and place where citizens got together to meet up with friends, trade ideas, and crucially have fun. So let's all commit to helping our post-pandemic town centres continue to do all of this and more. I'd like to point you to our next lunchtime launch session, which will be on Earth Day on the 22nd of April, which will be about successful sustainable development in London. We'll be showcasing approaches pioneered by two of CRP's partner business improvement districts, Midtown and North Bank. Please do sign up. Any queries that you do have, please feel free to get in touch with any of us shown on this screen. Our email addresses are there. I'd like to thank all of our speakers today for some really thought-provoking conversations. A huge thank you to all of you for giving up your time to join us. Remember to stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Thank you.